Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. So today we're going to do my blind pick tier list, and tomorrow we're going to do my counter pick tier list for mid lane. Now obviously this is all just my opinion, but I think it's fairly accurate, but of course take it with a grain of salt. I'll timestamp all the champions below, but first off I'm just going to start with a general explanation. So what makes a champion a good blind pick? Well, for me there's like three things I think about when I'm kind of evaluating champions like this, and the first one is matchups. So just like, how are this champion's matchups in general? You know, do they have a lot of bad matchups? Are they easily countered? Maybe all the meta matchups are actually quite good for them, or maybe they're very good at neutralizing bad matchups. So there's a lot of different champions, but to give some examples, you might have a champion like Ahri, that even though Ahri has like some bad matchups, she's actually very good at neutralizing these matchups. And then you might have other champs that are just like very good against other meta champs. So like Victor, for example, is kind of an anti-mage champion, and a lot of the meta at the moment is mages. So Victor would be a good blind more because his matchups are good, whereas Ahri would be a good blind more because she's good at neutralizing bad matchups. Next, we have compositions, both your team comp and the enemy team comp, and kind of like, how does your champion function against certain team comps? You know, does it require a certain team comp to be played and stuff like that? So again, if we come back to those good blinds, a champion like Ahri can function in basically any team comp and verse any team comp, so that makes it very versatile. If we say a champion that's a bit more specific, like maybe Karthus could be an example. So Karthus is a champion that really wants to be like the solo AP on his team. So Karthus maybe isn't the best blind because your team could also pick other APs, and also there are ways of dealing with Karthus, like with a lot of AoE shielding, like Karma. You can pick champions like Kindred, Spell Shield champions, or Immune champions. So Karthus would be an example of a champion that has like both counters compositionally and also is somewhat reliant on certain things on his team. Lastly, there's the off-meta aspect. So one thing to keep in mind is that when you pick a champion, especially one that plays in a different lane, or is just not normally picked mid, people won't often know what to pick against it. So let me give an example. If you play something like Aatrox mid, one, people don't know what to play against this champion. You know, you lock in Aatrox, the average person doesn't know what to play against it. And second, is that people will probably just automatically assume that it's going top. And a little kind of trick that you can do with this is people actually see what champions you hover in Champ Select. So if you're going to pick like an ADC mid, or you're going to pick like a top laner mid or a jungler mid or whatever, try and hover champions from that role before you lock it in. So if you're if you're going to play Aatrox, hover, a bunch of top laners, hover like Jax, Fiora, Camille, etc. And when you lock it in, people will be like, okay, that champion is definitely going top, right? But in reality, it will be mid. Another little trick that you can do with that, and that I think people do at the higher level sometimes, is they actually ban a champion from the lane the champion is normally played in. So again, if you normally play Aatrox top, maybe you ban Camille, and then you end up going mid, and people are like, okay, well, the Aatrox is definitely going top, because why else would he ban Camille, right? So there's a little mind game there, but I think the off-meta aspect for blind picking is actually pretty underrated, because again, like, people don't know what to play into it if it's a champion that's not seen often, and if it's a champion from a different lane, it can be quite hard to tell if it's actually going mid or not until like all 5 champions have locked in, and you've probably already picked your mid laner by then. All right, now let's get started with the tier list at long last. So S tier, pretty obvious, is going to be your premier blind picks in the game. A tier is going to be champs that are still very solid blind picks, but maybe not the best in the game. I think B is going to be champions that can be blind picked. Actually, there's solid blinds, they're just not as good as the other blinds, like they're maybe just pretty 50-50. C tier is going to be for champions that could be blinded but are much better as a counter pick, and D is pretty much going to be for champions that just can't be blind picked whatsoever. Obviously, this is a tier list for the strength of their blind pick, not for the strength of the champion as a whole, so keep that in mind as well. So let's get started here. First off, we have Aatrox. So Aatrox mid is a pretty good blind in my opinion. I'm going to say he's about an A tier blind. So I think like Aatrox can play in most compositions. It's kind of hard to counter Aatrox mid, especially when people don't know it's Aatrox mid. For a start, he's actually good. He's like really good against melee matchups, and he's pretty good against a lot of the weaker range champions as well. So I actually think Aatrox mid as a blind pick is pretty underrated. Ahri is for sure an S tier. Ahri has like the best neutralization of bad matchups like in the game right now. She has a ton of dashes, she has sustain, she has wave clear, and also just like a lot of the other champs that are meta can't really like punish her enough to actually make her not worth blinding. You know, like there are champions that can force Ahri out of lane, there are champions that get a lot of priority over her, but there's not many champions that can actually kill Ahri and just like make the lane unplayable. So I think Ahri is probably one of the best blind picks in the game, if not the best blind pick in the game. So if you need a blind pick in your champion pool, Ahri is probably the one. Akali. Now Akali's interesting because Akali used to be a very good blind pick, but I think in Okay, so I'll say the reasoning. Akali used to be a really good blind pick because, again, most of her bad matchups were very neutralizable. You could take a big sustain page, you take Resolve, TP, Fleet, etc., and you couldn't really be chunked out. Again, like you could kind of lose priority of the wave. Maybe you wouldn't be able to really, impact the map as much as you'd like, but you'd never die. You'd never really get so far behind that you just couldn't play the game. I think in season 12, though, it's not the best blind. It's for a couple of reasons. Like, one, scaling is a lot better. Two, I think some of the compositions are a bit harder for Akali. Like, there's a lot more like AoE shield supports, your Sonas, your Seraphines. And while you can one-shot these champs, it makes it harder for you to actually like one-shot the carries and stuff like that. And I think, yeah, just in general, people getting tankier made Akali's job a bit harder just because, like, before, you didn't really have to snowball the early game as Akali, and you still kind of don't, but it's like if you enter the mid game completely even as Akali, it's not as easy to one-shot people as it used to be. So in my mind, Akali is better as a counter, but she's still a fairly decent blind. So yeah, you can consider it, but they're definitely better blind picks. Akshan. So Akshan is a champion that I'm kind of torn on. I think he also is about a B. So there's a lot of things in Akshan that make him quite good. Like, he's got a pretty strong laning phase. Like, he does well in most matchups. The problem is that there are a lot of meta matchups that are very good against Akshan and similarly very good against Lucian. So if you're thinking of a lot of the meta mids, pretty much champs that are good against AD carry mids are normally ones that can farm from range and have CC to punish them from dashing in. So if you're thinking champions like, Victor, Syndra, Vex, like those sorts of champions, they can be very annoying. And also compositionally, Akshan can definitely be countered. Now, he's still a fairly decent blind. Like, I would say he's like a high B in my opinion. But again, there are better blinds. Anivia. So Anivia is pretty interesting. I would say Anivia is probably an A tier blind. So the thing is, Anivia is quite counterable in pro play, but it's kind of difficult to counter Anivia in solo queue. So the things that kind of counter Anivia is a lot of long range. So like a composition that you could see against Anivia would be something like, Azir, Ezreal, Jayce, or something like this. A lot of range can be very difficult for Anivia to deal with, and generally short range is very easy for Anivia to deal with. Also, a lot of the matchups that punish Anivia either aren't amazing right now, like assassins are a bit weaker than they used to be, and also champions that just like hard destroy Anivia. Again, like not a lot of them are played. Like there are definitely champions that you can play into Anivia to, again, like really bully her out, like Azir, Syndra, Victor. And those champions are fairly popular. So that kind of makes her like a bit lower. Like she'd definitely be a low A. But I think in solo queue, it's like most of the time, people aren't going to pick a lot of range. I think even in your bad matchups, once you hit level 6, you can pretty much just neutralize it with R. So yeah, I think she's a fairly solid A blind. Aurelion Sol. Now, actually, I should probably go. Okay, actually, no, I missed a few champs. Okay, Annie. I just like didn't see these. So Annie, in my opinion, is again probably a B. Maybe, yeah, I don't know. She's maybe like in here. Like, I feel like Annie is a pretty decent blind. She is sort of good against like most comps. And she doesn't really need anything special from her team either. Matchup wise, like there's not a lot of matchups that just like outright destroy Annie. At the same time, there aren't a lot of matchups that Annie just like outright destroys. So she's just like kind of a well-rounded champion. Honestly, she could maybe be higher than this. Like maybe she's like a high B, low A. Like it's pretty decent. I'd say like Annie conceptually as a blind pick is pretty good. It's just like, yeah, again, I don't know. There are better blinds, and she just doesn't really have a very defined role, I feel like. Like if you blind pick this champ, yeah, I don't know, it's sort of hard to counter. At the same time, and you don't really need stuff out of it, but you also don't really gain stuff out of blind picking it, because like, okay, if you blind pick a champion like Ahri, the kind of benefit that you get is your opponent is just like completely neutralized, right? If you blind Annie, it's like you do get slowed down a little. Like you might find it harder to snowball, and it does sort of need to snowball. So yeah, I guess all in all, she's about a B, but I could see it being a low A. Now we're still doing a little bit of off meta here. So Ashe. Now Ashe mid is honestly decent, and I think it's probably like here. Like, to be honest, there are just a lot of matchups that sort of destroy Ashe. Like maybe she should be here, honestly. The one like kind of thing you got going for her is people aren't gonna know it's Ashe mid. But problem with that is a lot of the things that people will blind pick will just be good versus Ashe anyway. So I would probably say Ashe is like either a D or a C. I'm honestly not sure where I'd put her. Okay, I'll probably say she's a C because I think Ashe with the combat sum can be quite good, and Ashe isn't a champion that needs to snowball her lane. So it's not like, you know, if you get neutralized, it's kind of fine. Like, you're going to scale really well anyway. So yeah, I think she's about here. Asol. So Asol is actually a, well, okay, in the past, Asol was a very good blind because he had extremely good roaming power. But now, like, Asol's roaming isn't that good, and also roaming in the game right now is not as valuable as it used to be. And there are a lot of champions that do quite well in the Asol, either, again, like longer range mages or assassins that can kind of get within his range. So I'd say, I don't know, conceptually, Aurelion Sol is actually a very good blind, but he just kind of doesn't have it at the moment. Like, his roaming isn't good enough to just completely ignore the lane. And I think, yeah, he's just not really good enough at neutralizing bad matchups. So I'd probably say he's like a low B, maybe a high C. Like, I wouldn't normally blind Azir, but if you're a one trick, Aurelion Sol, but if you're a one trick, you can definitely blind him. Now, Azir, a champion that I actually definitely would blind. Azir is for sure an S tier blind. So the thing with Azir is he is extremely well-rounded as a champion. He can go poke, DPS. He has a lot of self-peel, mobility. Like, the champ just has everything. On top of that, he has a strong laning phase and scales well. And the real big counter to Azir is a lot of poke. So you'll see in pro play, people will play stuff like Corki, Varus, or they might have champions like Jayce or Ezreal or even Ziggs. So you kind of like want a lot of poke and range, but those sorts of comps, they're really hard to execute in solo queue. And I think matchup-wise, Azir is completely fine. So in my opinion, Azir is like a very, very good blind. The only downside really is that he's, you know, sort of difficult to play, and maybe just like, yeah, not as good for the average person as Ahri is. Like, definitely Ahri is a lot easier to pick up, but Azir is very, very solid. Now, Brand, to be honest, guys, I like don't really know anything about Brand mid. My guess is that Brand is not very blindable. Like, I think most mages would kind of destroy him, and most assassins would kind of destroy him as well. So I'm going to put him in D tier, but this is kind of an uneducated take, if I'm honest with you. I have played Brand mid maybe like twice in my life, and I also very rarely see Brand mid. I haven't seen it in about a year, so yeah. Now Cassio. Now Cassio is sort of interesting. So Cassio is pretty counterable compositionally, either by a ton of engage or a ton of range. You kind of have to commit quite fully towards those. Like, if you only have some engage against Cassio, then she can like easily kite it out, right? Or if you only have some range against Cassio, she can actually sustain the poke back up. But if you really hard commit to one of those two identities, it's quite hard for Cassio. So I'd say Cassio. Okay, the good thing about Cassio is that she does have a very strong lane. She is good against a lot of the weaker mages, and a lot of the just the picks that people normally pick, like just random stuff. Like she's very versatile in matchups. Like, she can play against assassins very easily. She can play against weaker short range mages very easily. The problem is a lot of the strong meta picks like Victor, Azir, are very good against Cassio. So I would say normally Cassio is actually, okay, I don't know, like Cassio is probably like a B, where she can be blind picked. Maybe about here. Like, she can definitely be blind picked, but there are for sure better blinds. But if you're good at Cassio, like, you can definitely make it work. Honestly, maybe about, she's like somewhere in here. I'm not too like 100% on this. Like, obviously I play a lot of Cassio, but I mainly use her as a counter because I don't really want to blind pick it. And again, it's like, will people actually punish it correctly? You know, will people in lower elo be able to play a lot of these champs, or will they pick hard engage or lots of range? I'm not sure they will. So like, she is like somewhere in here probably, but I'm not like, yeah, I'm not 100% decided. Overall, I just don't think she's a great blind though, but it can work. So Cho'Gath. Now Cho'Gath is, I would say, a pretty good blind. Honestly, I will put him about here. So I think Cho'Gath is got pretty good matchups mid. Like, there aren't a lot of champs that just like hard destroy Cho'Gath, and again, like the ones that do, people aren't gonna think it's Cho'Gath mid. I also think compositionally, Cho'Gath can play against most things, mainly because he's got like a few different builds, right? Like, you can go tank Cho build, you can go an AP Cho build. So I actually think Cho's a pretty solid blind. Yeah, I actually kind of like it overall. It's got a lot of sustain. It's pretty good for neutralizing as well. Corki. So Corki is another interesting one. Corki is a better blind than people realize. And when he's OP, he's a very good blind. So the thing, I'm going to put it here for now, but the thing about Corki, right, is he has a lot of wave clear. And at level 6, he can neutralize basically any matchup. And he scales like an absolute monster. So he doesn't need to like snowball the lane at all. In fact, if Corki is behind in lane, he's actually probably ahead. So that kind of makes it so Corki is like a good blind normally, especially in like season 12, when there's like, yeah, when scaling is like very heavily incentivized. The only problem is that it's like you lose a lot of agency in the game. So I think Corki can be blinded, but you're kind of like at your team's mercy. Like, are they gonna help you mid? Are they gonna not die to the roams and kind of just like the random stuff that's going on? So yeah, I don't know. It's a champion that can be blinded, but I probably wouldn't recommend it. Like maybe a low B, high C. Yeah, that's kind of what I think. Now, I'm not sure if I should put champs like Camille and Darius on here. I feel like they're pretty much just used as counters. Yeah, I'll probably save them for the counter pick video. Like you could blind these champs mid, I guess. But I think they're just like way better as counters. So I'm probably not really going to talk about them. Diana. I'm not really a big fan of Diana mid because I think Diana is just a lot better as a jungler. But for that reason, that people don't know it's going to be Diana mid, Diana is actually a pretty solid blind mid. I'd honestly say she's about here. It's sort of hard to counter Diana compositionally. But the downside being that there are like a few meta matchups that are good against Diana. So it definitely fits in here somewhere of just being like, it's an okay blind, probably better as a counter and definitely better just as a jungler overall. But yeah, like it can be decent. Ekko. Ekko is another very interesting champion because Ekko used to be a very, very good blind because Ekko was very difficult to kill. And he had enough wave clear that you could easily like neutralize and roam pretty much any matchup. And then compositionally, he is sort of hard to counter because he's got a lot of mobility. He has a lot of different ways to play. He can flank, he can split push. There's a lot of things he can do. The problem is Ekko just doesn't have the wave clear he used to have. And it's very easy to take advantage of an Ekko. Honestly, I would say, again, he is probably somewhere in here of being like, you could blind this champion, but I probably wouldn't. I think, if you're playing something like Vex or Silas or Cassio or just like any champ that's like somewhat strong early or good at countering melee champions, Ekko is going to have a hard time. So definitely better as a counter, in my opinion. Could be blind picked, but I kind of wouldn't recommend it. Now, what else have we got down here? Fizz. Fizz, again, same story. Used to be a very good blind. Kind of could kill people in basically any matchup. If he couldn't, he could just roam, has a lot of mobility and stuff like that. Honestly, I still think Fizz is a pretty solid blind. I'd say he's a high B. The biggest thing going against Fizz is that it is a bit harder to get kills at level 6 than it used to be. You still can, and you still have a lot of gank setup. Gank setup is really nice because it allows you to kind of like win matchups that you probably shouldn't be able to. Honestly, I'm like tempted to put him as a low A, but I think it's more like a high B. I would be a bit worried about being countered like... The thing is, if you got countered in lane or you got countered compositionally, that would probably be fine. The thing is, you don't want to get countered by both. If the enemy has like a lane counter and they have champions that are very hard to kill as Fizz, I could see that being a big problem. So yeah, I'd say he's a high B. He's a pretty good blind, but again, there are better choices. Galio. Now, Galio is a very good blind pick. Most of the champions that counter Galio can be neutralized fairly easily. Galio can like roam around the map. He does well in basically every composition, especially with dive compositions. Let me just check. Okay, yeah, my cam isn't covering this. Yeah, I like Galio as a blind. I'd say he's like maybe even like here. Like Galio is one of the better mid blinds at the moment. So I'm a big fan of Galio. Definitely recommend. Let's get rid of GeForce experience. What else have we got down here? Okay, Fiora, better counter pick. Gangplank, never seen a Gangplank mid. Gragas is a champion that I think you can play mid. And honestly, I think Gragas, again, is a pretty good blind mid. Like, he's probably more like a low A, but he does very well against melees. You can poke out mages like reasonably easy, especially the ones without sustain. There are definitely some matchups that could be very annoying for Gragas, but I think as a whole, they're honestly pretty good. And again, you're benefiting from the fact that people aren't going to expect Gragas mid. They're probably expecting Gragas jungle or Gragas top or something like that. So yeah, I actually think it's pretty good. What else? Heimer. Now, Heimer is interesting. Heimer, I would say, is probably like here or something. So Heimer, I don't know. He's better as a counter. A lot of mages destroy Heimer, but Heimer is also just like really good against a lot of the champions. I think he's probably better as a counter. maybe I'm kind of overrating him here. Maybe he's like more like here. I mean, he's a fine blind, but really there just are a lot of things better than Heimer to blind. Okay, now where are we at? Aurelia. So Aurelia is another very interesting champion. So I'm going to put Aurelia up here, but I'm probably going to move it. So the thing is, Aurelia, the things you get from playing Aurelia mid is one, people might think it's top, especially if you like hover top laners, ban a top champion, and your matchups mid are very, very good. The problem is, compositionally, Aurelia does have some problems. Aurelia can be countered by the enemy comp if they have a lot of CC, and also you're somewhat reliant on your own comp. Like if you're picking an AD mid, you have to be a little careful of just like having a full AD team comp. Like this doesn't really happen much in Hilo. Right, like if you pick an AD mid, your jungler will probably pick AP. But I know in lower elo, like people don't really seem to think that. So in my mind, Aurelia can be blind picked, and she's like a fairly decent blind pick, especially if you're good at her. But it's just so much better to counter pick as Aurelia. So yeah, I would just say it's like, again, if you're an Aurelia one trick, she is fine to blind, but it's just like you might as well just play a different champion that's better at blinding and just save Aurelia as your counter pick, and you will just like win way more games, in my opinion. Okay. What else do we have? Jayce? Jayce, I'm not really a fan of as a blind. I actually think Jayce is sort of... Okay, like, here's the thing with Jayce. Jayce is countered by a lot of the strong... Okay, no, this is too low. Like, Jayce is like here or something. Jayce is pretty strong in lane, but there's like a couple problems. It's like a lot of mages are very good against Jayce. So it's like, even if people think you're going top, it doesn't really matter because the champ they're going to pick is probably good against you anyway. The other thing is Jayce, to get a lot out of Jayce, you actually have to be like really, really good at it. I'm not talking just like challenger, like you have to be like challenger plus. You know, this is like, you could blind pick Jayce mid if you're Chovy and you know, some other high tier mid, but at that point it's like you might as well just be playing another champion anyway, because like they can play everything. So I wouldn't recommend blinding Jayce, but I suppose like if you're really good at him, like you could, but I think you're definitely making things a bit harder for yourself. Okay, Karma will be the next one. So Karma is another champion that's a very, very good blind. I'd say she's about here. In fact, maybe, yeah, no. Okay, about here. So Karma, she scales pretty well. She gets priority in basically every mid lane matchup. And she's not super easy to counter compositionally, and she is... Okay, the champions that counter Karma mid typically do so by like outscaling her. So you'll pick something like Victor or Corki into Karma, and you just get like free scaling, which is like problematic, but you can still carry the game as a Karma before then. So I think Karma is a very solid blind overall. Karthus. So we've kind of talked about Karthus a little. Karthus has some pretty good matchups, honestly, but he's very countered compositionally, and yeah, his teammates can like really troll him. So I'd probably put him somewhere in here. Like I wouldn't normally blind pick Karthus. Much better as a counter pick. Kassadin. Kassadin is another really weird one. I actually think Kassadin is a better blind than people realize. He is like honestly a pretty solid blind. In a lot of bad matchups, you can just build a lot of armor. And also it's like sort of hard to really end the game early. You know, like if someone snowballs against the Kassadin, there's not that much they can do to actually end the game before Kassadin kind of ends up becoming relevant. So I actually think Kassadin is a pretty solid blind, but again, it's like much better as a counter pick. So like, why would you blind it? But if you're a Kassadin one trick, like, yeah, it can definitely work. I'd say he's probably more like, yeah, he's a fairly solid blind. Where am I up to? Katarina. So Katarina has definitely been hurt massively by Season 12. Katarina used to be a very good blind because she could basically just ignore her lane completely and snowball the game very early in the game. I think the problem now is that the game is harder to snowball, and there are so many champs that counter Katarina mid. I think if you're a Katarina one trick, you can make it work, but again, like Katarina counterpick is actually pretty good, but if you're blinding Katarina, you're making the game like so much harder for yourself than it needs to be. I really don't think it's a good blind pick. Just much, much better as a counterpick. Kayle. So Kayle, what do I think about Kayle? Yeah, probably somewhere in here. Honestly, yeah, like pretty low B. The problem with Kayle is like her matchups are actually not too bad. A lot of the matchups though, you will be end up like giving free farm She's somewhat team comp reliant, I think. Like, it's really good if you reverse a shorter range comp, and it's also really good if you have like champions to buff on your team, like either carries or like diving champions. So it's something I would probably pick situationally. I wouldn't normally blind her, I wouldn't say. Kennen? So Kennen, I would say, is probably about here. Like, it's a pretty good mid blind, honestly. It's pretty good against a lot of champions that don't have either mobility or a disengage. So like the way Kennen normally kills people is like just all-inning them at 6 or like flashing them in team fights, right? So if you're a champion with mobility, you can disengage from this, or if you're a champion with the disengage, so stuff like Syndra E, for example, then you can kind of like kite it out, right? But if you're not that sort of champion, Kennen can actually kind of destroy you. So yeah, people won't expect it to be Kennen mid a lot of the time. The only reason I don't really have Kennen higher is I think in the current meta, a lot of the champs are very good against them. You know, again, if we're talking about champions like Azir, Victor, Ahri, like these are champions that are quite hard for Kennen to kill. But if you're kind of playing in lower elo and you don't see those sorts of champs very often, then I actually think Kennen's pretty good. Okay. LeBlanc. Now, LeBlanc is a champion that has really fallen from grace, honestly. So, okay, here's the thing. LeBlanc used to be an S blind. The reason was, okay, so this was last year. Last year, I blind picked LeBlanc basically whenever I could. And the reasoning was that LeBlanc, even in her bad matchups, still had gank set up and still snowballed and could like scale pretty well, was good at skirmishing. So even when you got countered, it was mostly fine. On top of that, the champions that actually countered LeBlanc, I would say the only ones that were really bad were like, there were Kassadin, which I would ban, and then there was Lissandra, which is honestly completely fine. Like Lissandra is a neutralizer, but it can be killed. And Malzahar is another one, a neutralizer that can definitely be killed. So I thought those matchups were fine. The problem is now, if we're thinking about like what's meta, first off, assassins aren't as good as they were before, right? On top of that, like the team compositions, because scaling is incentivized, again, we see stuff like Soraka, Sona, Seraphine more often than we did before. It's still not like a ton, right? But those comps can be annoying because it can be really hard for LeBlanc to actually just like kill someone 100-0 with those sorts of champions. And on top of that, there are a couple new champions sort of added this year that make it more difficult to blind LeBlanc. So Ahri is, again, a very good neutralizer. Like I would say a better neutralizer than Lissandra against LeBlanc, honestly. Like LeBlanc can win, but Ahri really slows you down. And Vex is another one. So Vex, I think, again, like at a high level, if you're like ganking a Vex as LeBlanc, it's actually like sort of good for LeBlanc, but just like isolated solo queue 1v1, I would say Vex on average is more useful. So LeBlanc used to be such a good blind. And honestly, she still sort of is. I'd say she's like a very high B, where she is probably a better counter, but like, you know, I would be tempted to give it a low A. Like LeBlanc is one of the better blinds, to be honest. Like not as good as like these ones, right? But just in terms of like pure mid laners, I'm not sure. Low A, high B. Okay, I think if you ban like one of the matchups, like you ban Kassadin or you ban Vex, and like people aren't picking like Ahri every game or something, yeah, I'll say it's still an A minus. I could definitely see an argument for B plus. What else do we have? So next, I would say I'm not going to cover Cog. Lissandra. Lissandra is not as good a blind as it used to. So when Lissandra was a good blind, she had a lot more wave clear than she does now. Her Q is on a lower cooldown. She is still very good against assassins, but most mages are quite good against Lissandra. I'd still say she's fairly decent as a blind, like maybe about here. But she's actually way better just like countering either like assassins or countering like weak mages. Like Ahri is another one that can be countered by Lissandra, so somewhere in here. Lucian, same problem as Akshan. Lucian has got like good matchups, but is kind of like countered by the meta. Yeah, I'm just gonna put him like right next to Akshan. I think just Lucian, you don't really get enough out of blinding him, and you kind of just need to snowball on Lucian, I would say, to be useful at the moment. So definitely better as a counter. I think Akshan and Lucian are basically interchangeable at the moment. Very similar champions. So, yeah. Now, Lulu, I guess I'll cover Lulu. I think Lulu is actually a pretty good blind. Probably put her about here. Again, people won't know it's Lulu mid. She's good against pretty much every melee champion. She's decent against a lot of the range champions. Now, there are some, like Azir, Victor, Syndra, champions that have very long range and have very strong laning phases. These are quite hard for Lulu. Also, She kind of needs to be played with a carry on her team. But like you're almost always going to have a carry, right? Like either an ADC or a top laner or a jungler. So she's a pretty good blind. There are kind of problems with her though, like definitely A-, B+, something in there. Lux. I think Lux is actually a very good blind. Lux is like one of the higher tier blinds. She is good in most comps. She has a lot of range. She has wave clear, and at level 6 you can neutralize basically any matchup. She does still have some bad matchups. Like she's good at neutralizing matchups, don't get me wrong. Especially because you can take a defensive sum and just wave clear, but there are definitely some bad matchups. But yeah, I think she's pretty solid overall. I think Lux is kind of a champion that does take a little bit of getting used to though. You know, like the way you play an aggressive matchup as Lux is going to be completely different from a defensive matchup. Like an aggressive matchup, you'd be like eating your opponent on cooldown, you know, looking for aggressive Qs. If you're in a bad matchup as Lux, you're probably like saving your Q defensively, only Eing if your opponent tries to trade into you, and then just like using your ult on waves, something like that. Malzahar. Malzahar is honestly not a very good blind. So Malz is very overrated as a blind. The thing is, Malz scales very well, so he can like make up for kind of like losing lane a lot of the time. But Malz is so easily counterable by basically everything. Like Malz just has pretty much a non-existent laning phase. Now, once you get to like Lost Chapter, which you can kind of get early if you do like the Sapphire Futures Market Cheese, you can start to do well, but I think, yeah, I don't know. It's like somewhere in here, honestly. It's a champ that you could blind and you could neutralize matchups, but it's way better to just pick Malz versus like an easy matchup and against a short range team comp, and then you just like get a free win pretty much. So I much prefer Malz as a counter. Could be blinded though, but I wouldn't really recommend it. Morgana, I haven't really seen a Morgana mid in a while, so I'm probably not even going to cover it. Neeko. Where did I say Neeko? Neeko is another champ that used to be a very good blind. I'd say Neeko is kind of gapped by the meta, honestly. The problem is Neeko is very good against short range, and just a lot of the meta is long range. Also, she's not as strong in lane as she used to be, so it's an okay blind. Not amazing. A champion like Mord, I guess I'll put Mord on here because I think he's much better as a counter. I don't think Mord is like a very good blind mid, but I'm going to put him on here just because I'm going to talk about him as a counter in the next video, I'm pretty sure. I think Mord is like very good against melee champions. He's just like very not good against range champions, especially ones with mobility. But Mord actually is an underrated mid laner, so I should put him on here. But I'll probably talk about him more in the counter pick video. Nocturne kind of falls into the same boat. Nocturne used to be a very good blind, kind of just gapped by the meta, is probably a better blind overall than Mord. Much better as a counter. What else we got here? Okay, Ori. So Ori is a very solid blind. Ori should be probably up here. She is one of the better blinds. The only reason that I would say Ori is not higher is, again, sort of because of the meta. Ori is, she's just like, I don't know, maybe she should be a bit higher. Like, yeah, maybe about here. Like, she's basically good against every comp. And she can be played with pretty much anything. None of her matchups are like particularly bad. It's just like, is she as good a blind as these champions? Like, the thing is, like, these champions have mobility and Orianna doesn't, so Orianna can be like ganked, she can be punished by hard engage. But yeah, she's still a very good blind. I think these champs are a little better though. What else do we have here? Where am I? Somewhere down here. Okay. Ornn, pretty decent blind. Much better as a, actually, honestly, is like up here. Pretty solid blind, or maybe like here. Yeah, solid blind, much better as a counter in my opinion. I suppose like Malphite's actually like that as well. Actually, Malphite's more like here. Very good counter. Not really a blind at all. Covered all those. Pantheon, I guess I'll put Pantheon on here. I think kind of the same. Pantheon used to be very good blind because of his gank setup, but the problem with Pantheon is that he's just not as strong as he used to be. Much better as a counter. Honestly, he just like isn't that great anymore. So I don't know. I don't want it to be, okay, the thing is, I don't want this to be influenced too much by the champion's current power, because like the thing that Pantheon does have going for him, gank setup, strong laning phase, and ability to roam, but he's definitely much better in an early game centric meta, and this isn't really that. So yeah, he's not really that great at blind anymore. Probably is, yeah, about there. Okay, Kiana. Kiana is honestly not bad. I would say Kiana is like very similar to Fizz. Like the bad matchups can be neutralized just by farming with Bush Q, but it can be sort of difficult to roam, and there are matchups that just like destroy Kiana. So I think he's definitely better as a counter. But again, can be blinded. And I think if the game goes back to being like roaming heavy and like a bit more early game, champions like Fizz and Kiana are more like A tier. But just at the moment, they're not as good at being blinded. Okay, covered that line. All right, Rumble. Actually, you know what? I'll put a few on here. So Renekton, similar reasons to before. Good against melees, not good against much else. Should be in here somewhere. Riven. Riven's a decent blind, mainly because people won't know what to pick against her. She could probably be like somewhere in here. Yeah, most people will have no idea what to pick against Riven. Honestly, she could be higher than this. I've only seen Riven mid like a couple times, and it actually looked really good when it was picked. So it could potentially be like right here. Yeah, I'll maybe pull like right here. To be honest, I don't know enough about Riven mid to know for sure, but every time I've seen Riven mid, it's looked good, and I think it's like sort of a hard champ to counter, and again, like most of the time, you're going to assume it's Riven top. Okay, Rumble. Rumble is a pretty good blind. I would say Rumble is like right about here, I would say. Rumble is like has the ability to farm from range just by being a melee champion. Has shield, obviously, so can sustain through a lot of damage. Again, kind of the problem with Rumble is that a lot of the meta is good against him. Rumble is not that good against mages with mobility. He's very good against mages that are immobile, but not very good against a lot of the meta like the mobility mages. So yeah, somewhere about here, I would say. Okay. Let me know in the comments, by the way, if there's like champs I've missed or you'd like me to talk about. So I'm not talking about everything because it'll take forever, but I am talking about most of them. Okay, Rise. Now, Rise is a low A. So the things that make Rise a good blind pick, he gets priority in basically every single matchup. He's good at snowballing the early game. And he doesn't really have any bad matchups. Like, Rise is just pretty solid. Now, the thing that kind of brings Rise down is he's very counterable compositionally, and he does kind of require some things from his team, in my opinion. So, like, Rise is very short range, can be punished with hard engage or range of their own. And also, Rise is much better with a ganking jungler because he has point and click gank setup, and he kind of needs to snowball the early game. So, like, stuff like Rise Lee Sin, Rise Xin Zhao, Rise Jarvan, like, these are really good combos. If you played something like Rise Evelyn, I would be very unhappy. So he's pretty good, but again, there are better blinds. Looking through this. Okay, champions like Sion. Oh wait, I guess I'll put Seraphine on here. I think Seraphine's a pretty decent blind, kind of similar to Lulu. Could honestly just be like somewhere in here. There are some champions that can just hard outscale, and also she's kind of bad against assassins, but it could probably work if you were really like, you know, if you really wanted to make it work, you can make it work. That's what I'm trying to say. Singed, much better as a counter. Can actually be blinded. Again, I don't think anyone really knows what to pick into Singed. It's also kind of awkward because the thing about Singed, he's quite tanky. So you kind of want to pick a champ that's good against tanks, but also you kind of need mobility, otherwise you just get ganked. And there's not many champions that have both. So like Azir is an example of a champ that has both. But if you think of champions that are good against tanks normally, so you go like your Victors, Cassios, stuff like that, they're very immobile. And if you think of the champs that are mobile, they're normally not very good against tanks. So like your Ahris, LeBlancs, Akalis, etc. So Singed, honestly, is a pretty good blind. I'd probably say he's somewhere up here. Honestly, he could maybe even be a low A. It's not a champion I play personally, but I do think he is quite good. So yeah, that's kind of what I think. Skarner, no, Skarner is not a mid laner. Sion should probably go in here. I think Sion is also, I'd actually maybe put Sion up here. Like, Sion is a very good blind mid. He's good against, like, most mages can't do anything against him. He gets to scale for free. People will think he's top. He's very good against melee, so I'm a big fan of Sion mid. Swain. Swain is probably a high B, maybe a low A. I'll say a low A. So there are some bad matchups. Okay, there are definitely bad matchups for Swain. Actually, I don't know. Is it too high? Maybe a high B. Like, I think Swain has a lot of bad matchups, but also, like, you can kind of neutralize them, and he still scales pretty well. And compositionally, it is sort of hard to counter Swain. Like, again, you kind of need range, but people aren't just going to like pick 5 range champs in solo queue. So yeah, I guess the matchups kind of hold him back, but team compositionally, he's actually fine. Where are we up to? Okay, Sylas and Syndra. So Sylas is normally, conceptually, Sylas is not a good blind. He has normally low wave clear, normally a weak laning phase. Now the Qmax build has kind of made this a lot better. And also Sylas is a champion that is kind of reliant on having ults, or like good ults. So I would probably say Sylas is actually a low A at the moment, mainly because of the Qmax build. And just because I think people don't often counter him with the right things. Like if you're thinking matchups that you really wouldn't want to play as Sylas mid, at least personally, I'd be thinking stuff like Aurelia, you know, Cassio, like these really like strong laning extended DPS champs. But like a lot of the time people just don't pick those. So I'd say he's probably about here. Normally Sylas should be a counter pick, but he is pretty overtuned, and the Qmax build does kind of allow him to be picked kind of where he shouldn't, I would say. Syndra. Syndra is another very weird one. So Syndra has a very strong laning phase and does very well against other mages. And this makes her a very good blind pick in competitive normally, because people don't pick a lot of assassins, right? The only assassins people really pick in competitive are stuff like Akali and maybe Irelia, if you count that as an assassin. More of a bruiser though. But in solo queue, not as good of a blind because, again, people will pick up a lot of assassins into her. She's also very immobile. Now, the thing is, because she's getting reworked, this could change a lot. I think she has a strong enough laning phase that she is a pretty good blind. Yeah, like, honestly, she's maybe like a high B as well. Could it even be a low A? I just think, like, she is counterable compositionally with Engage. She's also counterable matchup-wise, but she does have a strong laning phase. So she can, like, beat down a lot of these matchups, but she's not actually that great at neutralizing lanes. So yeah, high B, I think. Taliyah. Taliyah is honestly pretty good. I would say Taliyah is somewhere up here. Taliyah is one of the better mid blinds, maybe even higher. Right here. So Taliyah is a better blind pick and competitive than solo queue. Again, people don't play many assassins. I think Taliyah does kind of suffer against assassins a little bit, but a lot of those assassins that beat her in lane, she counters in team fights because they tend to have dashes, right? So I'm a pretty big fan of Taliyah. She has the wave clear after about like level 6, maybe even level 9 if you're really pushing it to like, that's when you can neutralize matchups if you just like can't play the matchups at all. Also think like she's a champion that can rush boots and like does pretty well with them. So a lot of skill shot mage matchups can be neutralized. I think you would still probably want to avoid playing this against like one of the really meta like OP champs. Again, like Victor could be hard, but at the same time, like these champs will poke you out, but they can't really kill you. I think Taliyah is really good blind, honestly. Yeah, she's a really good blind. Talon. Where would I put Talon? Talon's another champ that has just suffered from Season 12. Champions with wave clear and roaming used to be very good blinds because they could just run around the map and do whatever. But I think very similar, like honestly, all these kind of like roaming assassins are in the same boat where they now need to counterpick in order to snowball enough to win the game. Whereas before you could still snowball enough to win the game being counterpicked because one, you could snowball the game more than you could now. And two, it was just easier to kill people back then. So yeah, something like that. What else do we have? Okay, a champion like Tristana. I guess I should probably talk about it. Very similar to Lucian and Akshan. Yeah, it's just really similar to these champs, in my opinion. Honestly, Tristan's probably a better blind than these two, but I still think Trist kind of just isn't that great a blind. Like, there's a lot of mages that do really well into Trist, so I guess like the one advantage is that people probably don't think it's Trist mid, so it could probably be a bit higher than this, but I'm not super confident about it, if I'm honest. Okay, Tryndamere. Tryndamere is actually a pretty good mid laner. I would say Tryndamere is one of the better blinds. He's very good against most champs mid. Now, the biggest problem with Tryndamere is compositions. Again, like you kind of need AP on your team, and if a team has a lot of CC, it can be sort of hard for Tryndamere. So yeah, I'd say he's about here. Twisted Fate. Twisted Fate is a pretty good blind as well, but he maybe like... I'm not totally sure, because the thing with TF Again, very good at roaming, scales pretty well, offers a lot to basically every team comp, but he does have some horrendous matchups. Now, I think most of these matchups can be neutralized, but it more comes down to not just your skill at TF, but your skill as a player. Like a high-level TF that's good at defensive laning can honestly do quite a lot with him. But I think for the average player, yeah, I don't know. It's still quite a good blind. Like, don't get me wrong, TF is a good blind, but it's like quite difficult, I think, to make him a good blind. Yeah, but if you're good at it can definitely work. Okay, Varus. Now, Varus is starting to be played mid. Honestly, I would put Varus maybe down here. To be honest, I should probably put Ashe down here as well. Whereas, like, I think these champs should just, like, be purely used as counters. In fact, I'd maybe move... No, I think I'll leave him there. Like, these champions should pretty much only be used as counters. Varus, good against... there's a few things Varus is good against. Either mages with weak laning phases, or mages that are weak kind of to poke, or against champions that really suffer from getting auto-attacked a lot early. So just like weak laning champions in general, with the exception of Azir, because again, poke very good against Azir in the mid game. There are other mages that poke is sort of good against. Yeah, I don't know. It has some really good matchups. It also has some really bad matchups. So I'd basically never blind him. But he is a good counter pick, honestly. He is a pretty solid counter pick, I think. Oh, I just realized I missed Quinn. Quinn also, I would just use Quinn as a counter pick. You could blind Quinn, but I don't know. Actually, she's more like here. You could blind Quinn, but you're kind of doing yourself a disservice. I'd say before the durability patch, Quinn was a lot better, like maybe in the mid B somewhere. But I think now it's just, if you're playing Quinn, it should really be as a counter pick. Okay. Vayne, again, another champ that should be just as a counter pick, in my opinion. Very good against melees. Well, not just melees, like tank melees, Galio, Set, etc. We'll talk about that in the counter pick video tomorrow. Veigar, again, is another champ. Veigar's probably about here. Veigar used to be a very, very good blind. Like I say, Veigar actually used to be about here because he can neutralize basically any matchup. I think he's kind of been nerfed to the point where like his E cooldown's a bit longer. You can take advantage of him a bit more. Also, Predator's been nerfed, so like you can't just like, yeah, I don't know. It's not as easy to close the gap on some of those like longer range champions. So he's still a pretty good blind. Maybe this is a bit too high. A champ that, yeah, I don't know. He's a champ that can be blinded, but I'd much prefer him as a counter pick at this point. Vel'Koz. I'd actually say, no, he's not great. So, B or C? The thing with Vel'Koz, pretty good against range champs, very bad against melee champs. Some melee champs. He is actually good against some melee champs, bad against mobility melee champs. Yeah, I'd say he's a pretty, maybe a high C. I wouldn't be very happy blind picking Vel'Koz, honestly. You can neutralize matchups with wave clear, and he does have a strong lane, but I just don't think he really brings enough to justify it as a blind pick. Vex is either a low A or a high B. So the thing with Vex, very good against melee champions, also very good against weak range champions, like champs that can either be all in or don't have a strong laning phase. The problem is Vex has a very poor laning phase against range champs, but actually a very good laning phase against melee champs. She doesn't really require anything from her team. Sort of difficult to counter compositionally in solo queue. Like I think you can counter in competitive, but in solo queue is kind of hard. Yeah, I'd say she's maybe about here somewhere. She's a pretty good blind. The thing is, she is both a pretty good blind, but she's also a really, really good counter. Like, if you pick Vex as melee champions a lot of the time, or dash champions, she can get, like, a lot of value. And I do think Vex suffers against, again, like, strong laning mids. So, I think about here is fair. She could maybe be a bit lower. The thing is, like, okay, a champion like Syndra has much better good matchups and much worse bad matchups in a champion like Vex. Like Vex is a bit more like all around, you know, like her bad matchups, they're not that bad. Her good matchups, well, some of them are actually quite good. So yeah, I guess she deserves to be about here. Victor is a very good blind, but not quite as good as other stuff. I'd say Victor is somewhere about here. So Victor is very good against most champs in the game, but some assassins can be very hard for Victor. Not all of them, there's a lot of melee champs that Victor actually does kind of well against, and I'd still say Victor's a pretty solid blind, honestly. But yeah, I think he doesn't have mobility, does have a little bit of self-peel with his W and his like Q shield movement speed. So yeah, I think about an A is fair. Yeah, about an A is fair. Vlad. Where would I put Vlad? I would say Vlad is probably somewhere in here. The things you have going for you as Vlad, honestly, could maybe be higher. Like, the things you have going for you as Vlad could be top. People don't know what to pick into Vlad a lot of the time. But at the same time, is countered compositionally by, again, like immune champs or AoE shields or, you know, stuff of that nature. Does have some bad mid matchups. Certainly better as a counter. Yeah, I'll probably put him here, but a lot of it is from the off meta / like surprise factor. Like, people do not know what to pick into this champ, compositionally or in lane. So I think this is another champ that can be countered at a high level, but in solo queue will not be countered a lot of the time. Those are all kind of random champs. Xerath. Where would I say Xerath is? Xerath strikes me as similar to Vel'Koz, but the difference is that Xerath has a stun and also is a bit better at like just being useful. You know, like if you're in a bad matchup as Vel'Koz, the only thing you can really do is like AFK into your tower, right? Clear waves. Now, if you're Xerath, you can still ult skirmishes and stuff, so he should be higher than a C. I'm thinking Xerath he's a very good anti-mage counter in my opinion. He's probably somewhere like here. Yeah, like I don't think he's a great blind, but he does have wave clear and he does have a strong lane. Can be countered by sustain. Does have some bad matchups. Yeah, about a B in my opinion. Okay, Yasuo and Yone. These ones are kind of interesting. Always a little bit of a spicy topic. So, well, what would I say about Yasuo? The thing is, Yasuo matchup-wise is actually pretty good mid. Like, most of the Yasuo's matchups are pretty good. There are some bad ones, for sure, but most of them are pretty good. The problem is people do know it's going to be Yasuo mid a lot of the time. Also, you're very countered by CC, like, compositionally, and again, like, you need an AP champ much better with a champ like Diana. I would say if you're picking Yasuo with Diana or like a bunch of knockups already, he's probably about here. But if you're just picking Yasuo without seeing anything, I'd say he's probably about like here. Like he's very counterable. He does have a strong lane, but yeah, there are a lot of problems for Yasuo for sure. Yone, I'd say, is a bit better. Yone doesn't have as great, like, Yone, his bad matchups are not as bad as Yasuo, I'd say, and also his good matchups aren't quite as good as Yasuo. And again, like, he doesn't have just like a super OP comp, like Yasuo Diana is terrifying. Yone doesn't really have something like that, but I do think on average he is the better blind. So I'd probably say Yone blind is a bit higher, still not an OP blind by any means, just like average. Somewhere in here, I'd say. Yeah, somewhere about there. Okay. Zed, I guess? Yeah. Let's talk about Zed. So Zed, I actually think, is a pretty good blind. The reason is Zed has mobility. He can actually farm from range, and he is one of the few assassins that still has a pretty good time of killing people. And he also has like some more options available to him. Like he can go like more, not like sustained DPS, but you know, like there's a Conqueror build, for example, that he can do. So I actually quite like Zed as a blind. The only the big downside to Zed, in my opinion, is again that he's AD. So you're reliant on your team picking AP. Like you really don't want to end up as a full AD team. But yeah, like, I don't know. I think it's pretty solid, guys, but you can be counter compositionally. Maybe low A is too high. Maybe it's a high B. Like, he's certainly better as a counter, right? He's certainly better as a counter, but as far as assassins go, I think Zed's actually the best blind assassin. I guess other than LeBlanc, because she's like gang setup and stuff like that. I'm torn between high B and low A. It could really be either. I'll put a high B so the Zed mains don't go, there's no way he's an A, you know? My champ sucks. One Tricks always complain about their champ. Every one trick, not just Zed one tricks. Ziggs. Ziggs is an okay blind. I'd probably say he's about here, honestly. Like, yeah, you can neutralize some lanes. but it just doesn't really... You just don't really get enough. The thing is, like, Ziggs can neutralize lanes, but the way you actually get a lot of value out of Ziggs is by snowballing the game, by, like, taking a lot of towers with Herald. So you kind of need a winning matchup to do that. So yeah, I'm not really a fan of Ziggs blind. Zilean. I think Zilean is actually a really good blind. He'd probably be somewhere up here, maybe? So Zilean can neutralize most matchups. He works well with basically every comp. He has a lot of good matchups. Does have some bad matchups. Well, yeah, actually, he doesn't have a lot of good matchups. He has some good matchups. Good matchups for Zilean, just matchups where you can neutralize, basically. There's not really that many lanes that you can just, like, destroy a Zilean. Bad matchups, does have a few of them, but again, it's like a champ that the bad matchups aren't that bad and the good matchups aren't that good. So I think I actually quite like Zilean. Yeah, I'd say this is pretty fair. The thing is, like, you do kind of need a carry in your team, but you're almost always going to have, like, either a bruiser top jungle or, like, an AD carry that you can buff. So there's pretty much always someone you can buff. And failing that, you can kind of just, like, counter their team, right? Like, you can slow people down, look to just stun them, ult someone that's going to get burst and stuff like that. So pretty big fan of Zilean. Zoe. Zoe also, I think, is a pretty good blind. I would say Zoe is about here. So actually maybe a bit higher. Yeah, maybe about there, I'm thinking. So Zoe, the thing is, because of Zoe's, like, sums that she picks up randomly, a lot of matchups that are bad can actually become quite good, you know? Like, a lot of time, if you pick up an extra Ignite or an Exhaust or something, it completely changes how, like, who has control of the matchup for the kind of the duration that you have that sum. So I really like that. I also think the kind of comps that counter Zoe aren't played that often. Like, again, there's kind of two things that beat Zoe. Is like either a full team of hard engage. Okay, that can definitely happen in solo queue. Or again, like a team that has, like, even longer range. So you might see champions like, yeah, again, Xerath, Jayce, Ezreal, like champs that are kind of hard for you to poke out. This doesn't happen too much in solo queue. And there aren't too many matchups that I would say are just unplayable as Zoe. Yeah, and you can snowball really hard off skirmishes and just kind of random stuff that happens. So I really like Zoe as a blind. I guess maybe her biggest weakness is, like, she sort of lacks mobility, but it depends. Because, like, if it's just movement speed that she needs, she actually has that. It's just like, you know, if she needs, say, like, let me give an example. If you're against a champ like Jarvan, you really need, like, something to get out of his cage, right? You need, like, a flash or you know, a blink or a dash or whatever. But if you're just kiting out a champion like Ornn, movement speed is actually fine against a champ like that, right? So it kind of depends on the kind of engage. Again, if you're versus a champion like Leona, you probably need, like, a dash or something. If you're against a champion like Nautilus, you could probably be okay with movement speed, but yeah. So I think that's basically everything. Let me just look through it and see if there's anything I've missed. There will be some champions that I haven't covered that I'm going to talk about in the counterpick list tomorrow. And if there are other champions in here that you guys want me to talk about just in the comments, I'm definitely happy to see that. Okay, I don't think there's anything egregious I've missed, but let me know. Let me swap to the YouTube outro. So thank you guys for watching. My voice kind of hurts, actually, after talking for almost an hour straight, but let me know what you think. Once again, it is my opinion. I guess, actually, you know what, I should just... Oh, no, I'll leave it on this. I was going to say I should show the tier list again, but you guys can just go back and look at it. So thank you guys for watching. The counterpick tier list will be out tomorrow. Let me know what you think in the comments below. It is meant to be based on how good the champion itself is at blind picking and not a representation of how strong the champion is. But the problem is that I think meta matchups are something that plays into that. So naturally, how strong the champion is does have some kind of impact on it. But I've tried to be like, yeah, I've just tried to give my reasoning for it. But yeah, let me know if you guys like the video. Go ahead and like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys tomorrow for the counterpick tier list.